Sinners and saints in the church, here we go. The last class. I mean, there are some more folks we did not yet talk about, so we could actually revisit this topic one more time if we wanted to. But since next week is Holy Week, and I am fundamentally lazy, we're not doing this next week. I've got plenty happening. So just so you all know. So this week, we're going to talk about the hedonist. Now, for those who, that's a fancy word, so I've given you the definition on the screen. The hedonist is a person devoted to the pursuit of pleasure. So little fireworks up there. I mean, they're just chasing after whatever gives them satisfaction, whatever makes them feel good. And the hedonist we're talking about in particular, I'm not going to keep his name a surprise, is actually Thomas Becket. Because he's got such a great story. And we hear snippets of the story. We're going to hear a lot more of the story. But to open with, I thought we would open with the collect, or the special prayer for Thomas Becket. I mean, you'll see he did a lot of very, very sinful things along the way, but obviously he's revered enough that he's actually been given a place on a liturgical calendar in his own prayer. So let us pray. O God, our strength and our salvation, you called your servant Thomas Becket to be a shepherd of your people and a defender of your church. Keep your household from all evil and raise up among us faithful pastors and leaders who are wise in the ways of the gospel. Through Jesus Christ, the shepherd of our souls, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. So a couple of bits from scripture to sort of set the stage, if you will. From Proverbs we read, whoever loves pleasure will suffer want. Whoever loves wine and oil will not be rich. Meaning, of course, oh, here we go, here's Anna coming in. Meaning, of course, that, the pursuit of pleasure just for its own sake is pretty empty. And in fact, Ecclesiastes says pretty much that. Whatever my eyes desire, let me read that again. I can do better reading than that. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing them. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Right? So anything that brought him pleasure, and especially in this case, the work of his hands, he thought about it. It's like that chasing after pleasure. He summarizes it this way: all was vanity. Right? I love that image of chasing after wind. Right? Got an image of a dog barking at the wind. Like, what are you gonna do if you catch it? You can't even catch it, right? And nothing to be gained under the sun. So we're going to talk about the role of pleasure and what it gets or what it doesn't get us. And our subject tonight is, as I said, Thomas Becket. Sometimes you see his name written as Thomas A. Becket. And there are people with that kind of name, Thomas A. Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ. And that really is his name. But there's no Thomas A. Becket. It's just take out the A. It's just Thomas Becket. That was his name. The A is sort of an affectation, apparently, at least according to the text that I have. But he was a real fellow. He was born in London. But in London, they don't get it right either. There's a placard in London that says St. Thomas A. Becket. But they're right about he was born in a house near the spot where that placard is. He was born Thomas Becket to Matilda and Gilbert. The day was December 31st, which was the feast day of St. Thomas. That's why they called him Thomas. Probably the year 1120, although that's probably somewhat negotiable. Okay. So that's his beginning. He actually came from a pretty decent background. He went to good schools. His family had emigrated from France to England when Gilbert, his dad, was a young man. We don't know much about his mom, but Thomas studied first at the Augustinian Priory at Merton. It was about 15 miles outside of London, then went to a London school, and finally studied at the university in Paris. Right? Here we see some of the Merton Priory ruins. He had an excellent memory. He was always a very, very sharp young man. And people who knew him tended to feel fondly about him, be affectionate about him, and think well of him. he didn't always return that affection, that care to others. By all reports, and literally all reports of his contemporaries describe him as a very, very handsome young man. Very handsome young man. Well, this handsome young man, for reasons that are not disclosed in the book that I'm using anyway, was a clerk in the church. A clerk was like a cleric. As a clerk, he was a sort of one of the lower ordained orders. I mean, today we got bishop, priest, deacon. Well, a clerk would have been an ordained order that would have been one of the entry points, if you will, towards eventual ordination as a priest. But he didn't have to do all the things that deacons and priests had to do. He didn't have to. He wasn't taking any vows as yet. And he had to have his hair wearing that weird baton shirt, the shaved bit on top. But he could take on secular employment, which in fact he did. We'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the great advantages to being a clerk was that you had protection that the church offered you that was unavailable to anybody else. So, for example, if somebody was caught stealing and they were dragged into court, well, you know what? They might get whipped. At the very least, they might get whipped. They might even get hanged if they stole, depending upon what they stole and from whom. But if you're a clerk, even if you stole the exact same thing, you're probably going to just end up tucked away in a monastery somewhere. Here's your cell, here's your bread, here's your water. We'll see you in a few weeks. Not very difficult, not very painful. Certainly nowhere near close to the kind of punishment that would be inflicted on lay people. So there was that dual track system of justice. There was one system of justice for most folks and a very different system for anybody associated with the church. This will become important later in Thomas's life. So he goes to the university in Paris. When he finishes that, he lands himself a new job at a bank. He's a clerk for a London banker named Osbert Puttdeniers. I have no idea how to say that. The fellow apparently was known by a nickname Eightpence. Osbert paid his clerk, Thomas, his new clerk, pretty well, apparently. We don't know exactly how much, but Thomas, he developed a taste for the good life, including expensive hobbies like going hunting with the dogs or falconry. These all required some expenditure of money. He also realized that dressing the part was important. And so he, dressed more frivolously, if you will, in more spectacular fashion. And he hung out with people who were young men like him, boisterous and loud and just enjoying life to the fullest. This was just the beginning, however. In the year 1146, when he was all of 26 years old, Thomas traded up. He left the bank. He left Osbert's bank, and he went over to Canterbury. And he took up a position as clerk to Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury was then and remains the most powerful prelate or the most powerful church person in all of England. So this was a significant step for Thomas to take. The Archbishop quickly figured out this new clerk of his, sharp guy, very sharp guy, great administrator, had an amazing ability to settle disputes. And so Theobald would send him on diplomatic missions, right? And eventually he said, you need to know more, you need to learn more. So he sent him to Bologna to study there, to study both civil and church law, canon law. And so he would even be more educated, more prepared. On his return, he was ordained a deacon in the church. And not just that, he was installed as the Archdeacon of Canterbury. Now, to be the Archdeacon of Canterbury meant that he had incredible power and authority. And better yet, he made £100 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but this was the 12th century. So apparently it was a fair amount of money, a lot of money. Now, the problem with archdeacons is that they were never expected to live up to a high standard. I mean, there were expectations. He was expected to remain chaste. You're now ordained a deacon. Got to be chaste. You don't carry arms. You're a man of God. You're a man of peace. You don't gamble. You're a deacon. And you avoid doing anything that would cast the church in a bad light. Those are all the expectations. The reality for Thomas and for other archdeacons before him was markedly different, especially for Thomas. Unarmed? Nah, that doesn't work. He still liked to go hunting. No gambling? Forget that. He loves gambling, especially dice. Loved shooting the dice. Anything that would shine a light on the church? No, never mind that. He still dressed in as fancy and ostentatious a wardrobe as he could pull off. And then he did things like, if people were worried about penance, they had sinned and they were given penance by the church, they didn't want to do the penance. Thomas had a nice little gig going saying, well, listen, I'll tell you what, you give me this amount of money and I will write off your penance. You won't have to do your penance that's been prescribed for your sin. So we see how this plays out in later years with Martin Luther, when the sale of indulgences is one of the things that made Martin Luther go, I think we're getting this wrong, guys. So Thomas was doing all these behaviors that clearly were not particularly holy for an ordained man of God. At this point, full disclosure, it's like, okay, I get it. I get it. Nobody, I don't know how anybody lives up entirely to those expectations. I have fallen short myself once or twice along the way, to say the least. But archdeacons had a reputation. In fact, the question was often posed of archdeacons, certainly remained true of Thomas. It was posed like a kind of a theological question. It was simply this: can an archdeacon be saved? Meaning that they're supposed to live at this level, this higher level, but they really don't. They fall far, far short.
Was there more than one archdeacon?
There would only be one archdeacon in Canterbury.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, Theobald just adored Thomas, and he really tried turning a blind eye to everything Thomas was about and everything he was doing. He didn't want to hear the bad news, right? But just as Thomas had traded up leaving the bank for Canterbury, he traded up again in 1155. He resigned from the archbishop's service to join the household of the new king, Henry II. Right? Well, Theobald, man's heart was broken. But hey, it's the king. Now, the young king made Thomas his chancellor. So if he thought he was getting by well on 100 pounds a month as the archdeacon, now he was really able to bring in a whole lot more money, enjoy a whole lot more power and influence. And he began to live like a prince. I mean, he threw massive parties. So he had a crowd of servants. He lived in a sumptuously, richly appointed house. He continued all of his habits. He got new dogs and new horses for the hunt. He got new hawks. He even acquired some trained wolves for those occasions when you just had to go wolf hunting. Right? Not only that, he decided part of his work was to do diplomatic work and to go across to the continent. And well, how do you get there? Well, most of us would get on a ship. Oh, not Thomas. Thomas required 6. Why 6 ships? Well, he had a lot of people he had to take with him. He had his goods, his documents, all of his household. It was all needed. And so he really needed, he thought, 6 ships for him to do this work that he was doing, traveling back and forth to continental Europe. So the whole while he's surrounding himself with knights and nobles and high churchmen, and there's, not to mention gamblers and courtesans and just hangers-on of all kinds. At one point, Henry goes to war with France. I don't think this was an entirely uncommon phenomenon. He goes to war with France, and Thomas goes with him, not just to advise, not just to be in the background and to, and offer prayers as a good deacon, or still really archdeacon, believe it or not. But here he is, an archdeacon of the church. He puts on the helmet and the chainmail, and he goes into battle with Henry. And he rounds up his own soldiers, right? And he a hand-picked group of men, and he leads into battle. When the French king drove the English back at Toulouse, Thomas was going to retaliate. So he picked a small town of Quercy, however you say it in French. And what he did was actually quite horrific, because he took this poor little town and he burned it to the ground, slaughtering everybody who lived inside. This is the work of an archdeacon. Lovely. One day, very cold day, King Henry and Thomas are riding through London. They see this poor old guy. I know this guy's old, but at least he looks cold in the picture, right? And they see this guy, he's just shivering in the street. And King says, you know what, Thomas, you've got this beautiful fur-lined cloak. Wouldn't it be a gracious and good and godly thing to give your cloak to this poor, freezing man? Thomas said, "I'm not giving up my cloak." Henry reached for him. "Yeah, you are." And they started tussling. Well, off they come off the horses. Before you know it, they're rolling in the streets like two kids wrestling, and they're doing it and they're laughing at themselves. This is great sport. This is just great sport. They're having great fun. This guy's still freezing to death, by the way. Finally, Thomas relents and he gives the cloak over. All right, whatever. He gives up the cloak. But it's worth remembering that at no point did it ever occur to Henry, much less even Thomas, to think, maybe we should take pity on this poor man who is freezing to death. Instead, they took that as an opportunity for jesting and laughter, all at this man's expense. So we see Thomas, taking up arms when he's really not supposed to, and slaughtering that town when he's certainly not supposed to do that, and then not doing the thing that you would think he could do. He could easily do. He could have given away a cloak. He would have been fine, but he refused to do that. In the year 1161, Archbishop Theobald died. See the little mitre up there. So there's no archbishop in Canterbury. Well, if there's no archbishop, then you got to find a new one. Now, technically, theoretically, it was the monks of Canterbury Cathedral and the bishops of the realm who would elect a new archbishop. And then the king would endorse their candidate. Well, in reality, if the king had a candidate, the king would say, "This is my man. This is my guy." And Henry started thinking about this and saw this as a great opportunity because in his view, the church in England had become far too independent. Far too independent. Decades churchmen had lived under the royal thumb, right? But they saw themselves as distinct from everybody else. Loyal, certainly loyal to the king, but not subservient to the king. They were not really as closely aligned to the king as they were to the Pope. Again, another threat to the king's own authority. So the stronger the church is, the harder it is for the king to exercise his own will, to dictate policy to the English hierarchy. So Henry decided, he figured out a way that he could reassert royal authority over the church. And there was no better way to do that than to have his guy installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. A fellow with whom he had hunted and drank and joked and laughed. Somebody who was loyal to him, who saw things the way that he did, who went on military campaigns with him. Who better than could you think of than his buddy Thomas Becket? Now, if the other members of the monks of the cathedral and the other bishops were not entirely on board with this, he was able to convince them that this was indeed the right choice. He had to push pretty hard for that to happen, and he did push hard, and it did happen. And they set aside their judgment, and they gave Henry, the archbishop, the archbishop he thought he wanted. On June 2nd, 1162, Thomas the archdeacon was ordained a priest. Can't be a bishop unless you're a priest. Okay, take a breath, have a good night's rest, come back tomorrow, because on June 3rd, he's going to be consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury. And there were days of feasting and celebration that followed. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, you're installing a new bishop. It's, you can get any excuse for a party, right? And that apparently remained true. And at one point, a band of jesters who had been there entertaining and doing their music and their whatever they did, whatever their entertainment was, they went up to the new archbishop and they requested payment. They sought to be rewarded for their efforts. They thought this was a pretty safe and okay thing to do because, after all, Thomas had a history of always treating players and musicians and other entertainers with great generosity. Not so much this time. Not so much this time. Thomas looked at him and said, "No, I'm not the man I was when I was chancellor. Church funds are for the church and for the poor. I have nothing to give you." Okay, so we're starting to see the inklings of a somewhat different man than when he was just a clerk or just an archdeacon or just a chancellor, right? We're starting to see something else, some other quality begin to emerge. he was still a worldly man. He was could still be ruthless. I mean, that had been part of his past. But we're starting to see him begin to change somewhat into a man of God and defender of the church. It wasn't an all-at-once kind of a conversion like we've talked about with some of the other folks that we've talked about in some of the other sessions. He still had expensive tastes, and he was a leading churchman in all of England. He could live a really good lifestyle. He still went hunting, for example. But you know what? Even though he was arguably the most important, most powerful churchman in all of England, his archdiocese was the smallest. This is a guy who'd been gallivanting around Europe and throughout the realm, and to stay cooped up in his own little archdiocese was boring. So rather than just stay cooped up in Canterbury, he took to traveling far and wide, visiting other dioceses, ostensibly on church business, of course. But this wasn't exactly necessarily part of his responsibilities as an archbishop. I mean, these were all formal visits. But this was high living, and the journeys were really quite pointless. And the Pope at the time, Alexander II, got wind of this. And when he heard about it, eventually he wrote to Thomas, and he offered him a little fatherly advice. He said, first of all, you must shut yourself in the church at Canterbury. Put all this wandering around, just unseemly, right? Then he went on to say, you must reduce yourself to mere necessities, not the extravagant living that he had enjoyed all of his adulthood. And finally, he also added this, and do stop chasing about all over the country. Do stop, please. Well, so Thomas is a little chastened here. And he doesn't have much time to reflect on this or to stew about this because it's the following year, is it not? Yes, it is. In 1163, Henry makes his first move to assert royal authority over the church in England. You remember the whole question about criminal justice? If a cleric is caught stealing, that they get punished. Their punishment is basically a slap on the wrist as opposed to being whipped or hanged. Well, Thomas seeks to end this practice. He says the church courts are treating clerical thieves, traitors, and murderers way too lenient. He says, listen, if a member of the church is guilty of something serious, the church should strip him of his clerical status, right? Hand him over to the state. Hand him over to the state for just punishment. To Henry, this seemed right and just, equitable and fair. Henry, for his part, said, yeah, that doesn't work for us. He expected Thomas said that. Henry expected Thomas to kind of go along with this. And Thomas said, no, not going to do it. He said, listen, speaking on behalf of the English bishops, we recognize the laws of the state, and we will support them, and we do support them, as long as they don't infringe on them, as long as they don't limit the rights and the liberty of the church. Furthermore, and by the way, in his view, as churchmen, laymen don't possess any right, and they possess certainly no authority to sit in judgment on members of the clergy. Okay, now we might hear that today and go, really? That's what you guys are arguing about? That's what they were arguing about, and it was pretty brutal. Went well beyond just who gets to punish the pilfering priest, right? The real conflict was Henry wanted to rule over the church the way he ruled over his barons, everybody else. Thomas, for his part, understood that if he gave in to any extent, he would compromise the independence of the entire church. So over the next year, both Henry and Thomas, king and archbishop, got more and more dug in. They each got more extreme in their positions. The fight got personal, right? At one point, Thomas was charged with criminal mismanagement during his time as chancellor. Henry had imposed upon him a fine, your choice, either 30,000 gold marks, or if you prefer, 180,000 pounds. That's your fine, pay up. Well, there was no way Thomas could ever pay that much money, ever. That was an impossible sum. It was meant to be an impossible sum. And now Henry's men are accusing Thomas to his face of treason. So at this point, Henry's afraid he's going to get He's afraid for his life. So he is so worried about his life, he gets on in a rowboat with 3 supporters, and they head for the coast of France. Off they go. This began 6 years of exile. And Thomas, for his part, was not easy to get along with during these 6 years. I mean, he was still very much entrenched in this debate, in this argument between himself and his once friend, Henry. And they went back and forth. Thomas, for example, decided what he would do is he would excommunicate all of his enemies. Okay, are you going to excommunicate your enemies, says Henry? Well, guess what I can do to your family? And he exiles all of Thomas's relatives, even infants, and does so in the middle of a bitterly cold winter. Out you go. By the time we get to the year 1170, even 2 of Thomas's greatest supporters, would have been King Louis of France and Pope Alexander, they were kind of done with the archbishop, right? They were done. This divide between them seemed absolute, irrevocable, and they were over it. But again, Thomas had reasons for holding firm because he understood that if he gave in even an inch, that Henry would take a mile and more. For Thomas, there was no room for compromise here. And the king couldn't back down either. So finally, and think about it from Henry's perspective. Thomas had been his friend, his traveling buddy, his drinking buddy, his hunting buddy, right? His wartime buddy. And now that buddy has now betrayed him. So I think we can understand why King Henry felt the way he did. Finally, in the year 1170, mediators arranged for Henry and Thomas to meet in person. Now, the lesson here about you want to resolve conflicts or sort something out. Doing so over the phone, or over text message, or by email is never as effective or as productive as face-to-face, right? I mean, we can communicate so much more effectively face-to-face. It's one of the great issues, I think, of the pandemic, and one of the great challenges that I think a lot of school kids face during all the time that they had to be masked up. It's like you lose that ability to really communicate and read other people, right? First time we did vestry meetings on Zoom, where a lot of people were like, I don't want you to see my face, or even if you could, we weren't in the same room. It just wasn't the level of communication, was there? That we've been used to in person. So anyway, so they get together. They've been apart for years. And then they realized, they started remembering, they kind of liked each other. And that remembrance, that memory of their affection for each other helped sort of warm, thaw the relations between them, warm them up a little bit. Finally, they got the worst of the issues resolved in December of 1170. Thomas Becket could return home to England. He gets to the dock in Sandwich. He goes to Canterbury. He walks into the cathedral. There's a big deal. He walks barefoot up the main aisle of his church, prostrated himself before the high altar. It looks like all is good, all is well, all has been restored. And if you thought that this meant that Thomas was going to somehow back down on what he believed about the rights of the church, absolutely not. And then something kind of pushed Thomas's buttons all over again. While he had been away at Henry II's request, the Archbishop of York, joined by 6 other English bishops, had crowned young Prince Henry King of England. Why should that be a big deal? Well, crowning an English king, that was the exclusive province of, you guessed it, the Archbishop of Canterbury. King had gone outside his authority, had bypassed the Archbishop in the manner that was expected and done. And so on Christmas Day, with the authority of the Pope behind him, Thomas dealt with this by this way. He looked at the Archbishop of York and 6 other bishops, and he said, you know what? You are all now excommunicated. Boom, done. They're out of here. Henry, meanwhile, is in Normandy. He's celebrating Christmas at a castle called Bourleroux, near Bayeux, and word of the excommunications reached him there. Flew into a rage. Apparently, he was good at flying into a rage. I mean, you think about it, the years of the anger at his friend Thomas, the sense of betrayal, the sense that maybe we've got it resolved, and now Thomas pulls this stunt. I mean, he shouts out what comes to mind. I mean, asks what is likely more of a rhetorical question than anything else. And there's different accounts offer different versions of this. But he said something to the effect of, "Will no one relieve me of this low-born priest? Or will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, troublesome priest?" I mean, no one knows exactly the words, but the sentiment remains. Now, this was, as I say, offered probably more as an expression of frustration, and anger, and just a spontaneous reaction, right? Turns out, if you're the king and you ask a question like that, there may be folks around you who take that question seriously. And indeed, there was somebody like that. And in fact, there were 4 of them present who heard that. 4 knights: Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard Le Breton. They hear this and they perceive this as a royal command and commission. So they set out for Canterbury. And off they go. And in fact, they've got money in their pockets funded by the excommunicated Archbishop of York. He was a little grumpy about being excommunicated. So fine, you need traveling money. And he gives them all the money they need for their journey to Canterbury. It's the afternoon of December 29th in the year 1170. The knights gallop into the cathedral precincts. They demand an interview with the Archbishop. Off they go to Canterbury. They storm in. Thomas met with them in his private quarters. The knights had insisted, you've got to lift the excommunications, and Thomas absolutely refused. Well, conversation did not get better from there. And they start arguing with each other, and then the knights threaten to end the Archbishop's life. And in fact, they go outside to gather their swords and armaments, which they left outside the church. Well, as soon as they do that, Thomas's attendants say, well, they're outside. They usher Thomas into the church where the monks are singing the vespers, the evening service. Once Thomas is safely inside the church, the monks lock the doors to keep the knights out, to keep the Archbishop safe. Thomas says, no, the cathedral is not a castle. And he goes and opens the doors himself. He was ascending the steps of the sanctuary, heading up towards the high altar, when the 4 knights stormed into the church, their helmets and their chain mail rattling, their swords drawn, and they're shouting, "Where is Thomas Becket, the traitor? Where is the Archbishop?" Thomas turned to answer, "Here I am." And he said, "By the way, no traitor to the king, but a priest of God." One of the knights, Fitzurse, came up behind the bishop, flicked off the skull cap with the point of his sword, just off his head, grabbed the Archbishop by the coat, tried to haul him outside. Thomas commanded him, "Get out of here, you abominable man. I'm not a traitor. I don't deserve to be treated this way." They actually ended up in a wrestling match, in a tussle. Thomas gave the man such a good shove, Fitzurse almost fell sprawling to the pavement. And they're yelling and shouting at each other. Well, now the knights, they're done. They're done with this guy. They're done with this argument, done with the wrestling. They've got swords. So they close in around the Archbishop and they say to him, "Now you die." We think about it. Thomas had just been brawling with these guys, like just a common brigand or something. And right there in the middle of his own cathedral, hardly a church-like thing or a saintly thing to do. Now he pulls himself together and he makes the sign of the cross and he says, "To God and to the Blessed Virgin Mary, to the blessed martyr Denis and to St. Alphege, Archbishop of Canterbury, and to the patrons of this place, I commend my spirit and the cause of the church." Crying out, "Strike, strike!" the knights hacked at the Archbishop with their swords. He fell, bleeding. They leave. One of them comes back just to make sure the job is done, puts his boot on the Archbishop's neck, plunges the sword into his skull, shattering the skull, scattering the Archbishop's brains on the pavement of Canterbury Cathedral, there by the high altar. Well, Now Thomas, whatever he had done before, was now a martyr. Martyrdom suited him. Pilgrims started showing up and reporting miracles at that site by visiting his tomb. Henry, on the other hand, did not come out of this looking quite so well. It had sounded to those, certainly at least to those 4 knights, that he had commanded the death of his own archbishop. That's not a good kingly thing to do, right? And there was some real danger here. There were rival monarchs might take this as an excuse, an opportunity to challenge Henry, to wage war on him. His own subjects might rebel against him because of what he did. And so to restore his reputation, he announced he would do public penance for the part that he had played in Thomas's death. He goes to the cathedral. It's July 12th, the year 1174. People of Canterbury are lined up as their king, barefoot, walks through a rainstorm to the cathedral, goes down into the crypt where, before the tomb of his old friend, Henry strips to the waist. Surrounding him are the bishops of the realm. Each of them there give him 5 blows across the back with a leather whip. Oh, and by the way, the 80 monks of Canterbury are also there, and they each give the king 3 more lashes each. But you know what? This question of papal and church authority versus royal power and authority remained an unsettled issue in England. It didn't resolve it, right? If Henry thought it would fix it. And in fact, it wasn't until almost 400 years later when this fellow, I think we all recognize, King Henry VIII, it wasn't until then that there was a definitive answer to how do you resolve the question of church versus royal power. Henry, of course, did it by severing his nation's ties to Rome, declaring himself the supreme head of the church in England. And 3 years after this, he sent his agents into Canterbury. He started by stripping all the gold, the silver, the jewels from St. Thomas's shrine, shipping them back to the royal treasury. This isn't church property anymore. It goes to the royal treasury, but they're not done yet. One more thing they wish to do, they pry open the tomb where St. Thomas had been lying in rest for nearly 3 centuries and destroy his remains. As Thomas Krall writes in his book, in Henry VIII's England, there could be no challenge to the king, even from a long dead saint. So the beginning of all this, 3 hours ago, we read this passage from Ecclesiastes. We talked about the pursuit of pleasure, and that those satisfactions are fleeting. Or as he summed up, all is vanity and a chasing after wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. So thinking about Thomas Becket, was his life vanity and the chasing after wind, or did he actually end up gaining something under the sun? So I want to start with that question. So what y'all think?
Well, I guess he gained martyrdom. That's a pretty important thing to gain.
Well, that's true. That's true. He did.
We should all be so fortunate. Well, I don't know. Not the way he got it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, hardly a way to do that. But it is kind of any aspects of the story that were surprising to you that.
How long was it between when he was ordained a priest from the moment when the archbishop passes and he's ordained a priest to become archbishop? I mean,
well, the Archbishop Theobald died in
1161.
It was 1161. It was the following June that he was ordained a priest, and then Archbishop the very next day after that. So it was less than a year. It was 1170 when he it was 1163 that started going into exile. It was 1170 when they started to reconcile. So just a short 8 years between a little over about 8.5 years from when he was first ordained to when he finally came back as archbishop and then was killed.
Because that first year, from what he went to priesthood, and all of a sudden, it's not a very long time when you've lived your life the way he lived his.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you think, well, it didn't happen overnight. There's that year in there that he, but you
Yeah.
think about it within a year,
But
that's not,
it almost did happen overnight.
yeah.
It almost seemed like from the time he was ordained a priest, that seemed to.
It's like he just, the realization hit
What
him.
was it, cleric? Is that what you?
When he
Clerk,
was a clerk, yeah.
right.
Yeah.
From that was a change, and maybe that kind of did it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's interesting because his priority all along seemed to have been himself, right?
Yes.
As a clerk, even as an archdeacon, as a chancellor, and even early on as a archbishop. I mean, he was still, remember, he wouldn't give up the cloak. He wouldn't do. I mean, he just when the knights come in and challenge him on the very night he's killed, he's still arguing with them and he's cursing them out. He's still, it's not until that very last moment when he goes, whoa. I mean. And yet, but he's a complicated man, because even though he's still very human, still very much looking after himself, he's taken on this new interest in defending, the church, right? I mean, that's what led to his need for exile. So that developed pretty quickly. So, I guess he was a more complicated man than we might have thought, in that he was defending the church, even while he was still very much, Thomas. He's still very much himself, his own man. Seems to me. But well, let's check in with our online friends. And David, what are your?
I mean, he did. He paid the ultimate price for what he believed. He did. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. He made his stand.
Yeah, he did. He did. And I know you probably know a whole lot more about Thomas Becket than I do. but
I'm not necessarily, because there have been so many variants on the story that nobody's really sure about the accuracy of any one of them.
right.
So, but the whole fact that he was such a reprobate, and then he grew into a total faith that he was willing to die for.
Yeah. Yeah. And like any good martyr story, I mean, you can spin it in a way that paints him even more like a martyr, more of a genuine saintly character, or to be honest, he could be portrayed as somebody who just at the end was backed into a corner, and what else could he do? But history tends to view him much more as a saintly martyr than anything else, certainly at the last.
Yeah. And who was the guy that? There was a guy that the play's based on a eyewitness account, is it not?
Murder in the Cathedral.
Yeah. There was I'm blanking on who wrote that. My gosh.
I can't. I've read that, but I can't remember. I read who wrote it.
I should remember who wrote it because I was in it.
Oh,
The
okay.
day I graduated.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you were one of the evil knights, were you not?
I was. I played somebody earlier in the first half of the play who was some officious, somebody or another, forget who. And then in the second half, I was one of the knights who got to off the archbishop. And then give a little soliloquy as to why that was the right and just thing to do.
Oh.
And we did this in the cathedral. It was St. Thomas in Albuquerque. That was
Okay.
for a long time. I still had my sword. Wonder where that ended up. Anyway,
Book by T.S. Eliot.
that's the guy. Thank you, T.S. Eliot.
What was
Yes, Elliot.
Murder in the Cathedral. Murder in the
Yeah,
Cathedral.
but and that's based on an eyewitness account.
Well, I believe it. Yeah. Of course, T.S. Eliot being the poet that he was, I mean, a lot of it is rendered in very, it's sort of like a Shakespeare approach to history, in that a lot of
Oh,
it
yeah.
poetry and I mean, there's
Watch
a
this
very heightened artistic sensibility to what he wrote. But I mean, it suits the material and it makes for a good play. It was a lot of fun to do. But any other comments
Well,
on?
the other,
Yeah, go ahead.
the other thing he did give us in a roundabout way, the Canterbury Tales. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, which gets me completely off topic, but I'm considering in a couple of years' time I'll be eligible for another sabbatical, right? Believe it or not. And I'm thinking I'm going to go to do the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage that you do that leads you to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Yeah. It's only about 35 days to, walk 500 miles. Why not?
How hard could it be, right?
So David, you need to be working on your training. I need a travel buddy. Who knows? This is what I'm thinking this week. Next week, who knows what my mind will come up with. But it sounds really interesting to me to do that. That'd be really different. Anyway, any other comments on Thomas or Henry?
No, now I've got to watch that movie. I had to say Netflix carries it.
Oh, which one?
Murder in the Cathedral.
Oh, do they really?
Yes.
Oh,
It
okay.
says it's on Netflix.
Yeah, and the other movie with Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton is just called Beckett.
Yeah.
It came out in 64,
Remembering that.
1964.
Yeah, and Kroll
And I was-
in his book said Beckett was not a Saxon. The portrayal of Thomas as a low-born Saxon upstart bossing around Norman nobles has no basis in history. It's a plot device from the 1964 movie Beckett, starring Burton and O'Toole.
How would you have liked to pick up the bar tab for that one?
Yeah, for that production. Yeah. Oh my.
Mind numbing.
Indeed.
Beckett.
Indeed.
But no, I think really Beckett's one of those guys. You're talking about going from one end to the other. He pretty much did, I think.
Yeah. And of course, the point of doing this series and the point of the book that Kroll wrote for us, and I'm taking this all from, is simply to remind us that, even when we do bad things, we make bad choices, and even when we do horrible things, and our motivation is even, entirely corrupt, that none of us is unsalvageable, so to speak, right? I mean, all of us can be saved. All of us can find redemption. And so ultimately, these stories for me are a point of hope, because I've never slaughtered an entire village, right? I don't live quite as ostentatiously as Henry did. I don't, I'm not a mass murderer like some of the folks we talked about. So golly, if they can get themselves sorted out with God, then there's got to be hope for me, right? For all of us.
He seems to be a lot better than some of them we've read through.
That's yeah.
Just one village burned and the people in
It was an underachiever, right?
That's
Only one
right.
village burned.
Yeah. If you're keeping score on the evil side, guy, he was a slacker. He could have got
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's too funny. All right. Well, any other comments, questions, observations? All right. Well, thanks for coming along on this little journey the last few weeks. I sure appreciate y'all being with us online and in person, and those who are watching afterwards, because I put this video on, and I know people are watching that. Kind of surprises me, but there we are. But and I don't know what we'll do next for an adult ed course, but we'll figure something out. If you have ideas or requests, let me know. Glad to hear it. And
No, this has been good, informative.
oh, M. Well,
Yes.
let me wrap up now. And I want to say something to M, sort of not for the record, as it were. So thank you all for joining us. Good night and goodbye.